Thought I'd begin with the images with which I left you the last time I shared with you. Those verses that we just heard seem to me like verses of reassurance. Seem to me like this image of floating in the arms of God, being buoyed up by God's love and presence, experiencing God's Spirit surrounding us. I got to do some of this on Thursday. On Friday, it felt more like this in the ocean where our family was, and maybe it feels more like this to us today. Trying to maintain a direction while we're being swept along, hoping that God's Spirit surrounds us and carries us forward rather than us being tumbled over. The surf was heavy on Friday, and I stood there thinking about whether I wanted to do any body surfing, and I decided, well, I'll try to go out, and if I can get one good run in, that will be enough. So I went out, I caught a wave, I felt good about that. I came out of the ocean, and then Andrew had some constructive criticism to offer me. I thought I could have done better, but it was good. Our passage from Isaiah also feels to me more like this. Our passage from Isaiah is one of several throughout Scripture that has God saying, I don't care about your worship. It has become an offense to me because you do not care sufficiently about justice, about mercy, about care for the oppressed. There are other passages in Amos 5, in Micah 6. We heard what does the Lord require of us? To seek justice, to love mercy, to walk humbly with God. The verses before that are, with what shall I come before the Lord? In the sense that it's not the sacrifices, the rituals that are called. I think of Luke 11, where Jesus says, where he chastises the Pharisees for tithing their herbs, but neglecting justice, and says you should do the latter while not neglecting the former. Isaiah is a complicated book, written probably over 4 centuries. Scholars have divided it for a long time into 1st, 2nd, and 3rd Isaiah, and then subsequently said, well, it's more complicated than that. The part that we heard read today is a kind of framing for all of Isaiah, a sense that we are talking about the need to care for justice and attributing the fall of Israel and then Judah to the Assyrians and the Babylonians to a neglect of those. With what shall I come before the Lord? Not with these sacrifices, not even with prayer, even if I lift my hands up. God says in this passage, they are covered in blood, and so I will not hear you. What's the message for us out of this? What I'd like to invite us to reflect on today is what is the balance between our worship and our care for one another and our calling to follow the way of Jesus and to welcome those to seek justice with God. A month ago, I was in Virginia with my mom's side of the family. This is the side of the family that Anthony is from, if you know him. And his dad, Phil, came up to me at one point and said, I have a professional question for you. What are you going to do about this? Let me say a little bit about Phil first. Phil is somebody who likes to argue. When I was young, before Anthony was born, I remember family gatherings where he would insist that he was 99 years old, just because my 8-year-old self would insist back, no, you're not. and to see what kind of conversation came out of this back and forth. Later in life, and again, Phil is brilliant. He's a physicist. He ran a physics lab at Florida State University. He doesn't care about football at all. He doesn't know anything more about football than I do. But I remember a discussion as adults about what position was the most intellectually demanding on a football team. Was it the quarterback or a linebacker? And again, Phil was adamant about things, not because he cared, just because he wanted to argue. So that's Phil. This conversation, this question was not that. Phil really wanted to hear, was really curious about, what are you, Pastor James, what are you, representative of the church that Phil is kind of at an arm's length from, going to do about this? And this, as we talked further, had at least two components. One was Christian nationalism. What are you, Christians, going to do about those who claim the name of Christ and act in ways that I, Phil, I, James, we do not understand to be Jesus' calling? And the second piece of it was, what are you going to do, church, that is diminished, that is grain, that is selling your property? What can you do to counteract the voice of those whose megaphone is much louder? This is going to be one of those reflections where I'm going to give you lots to think about and not a lot in terms of answers. So just hold that tension there, that wonder. And I'll tell you about another thing I did in July. I went to a convention, and Josh Richardson, who came here about a year ago before I was your pastor and shared with you, did a workshop there. And a couple of the things that he said really stuck with me. He made the point that the time we are living in now is nothing like the time that all of humanity has been developing in until now. So from the earliest days of culture, from the earliest stories in Scripture, the temperature, the global temperature, has been in this range. And society has emerged in a particular kind of climate. And then, the zero here is 1950, you see it spike up. What happened in 1950? Our CO2 emissions started rising very quickly. And you see this little blip in COVID when we thought, well, maybe we can do something else, and then we quickly just kept going back up there. And he made the point that this means that the world we live in does not fit our worldviews. That's true of infrastructure. We have built our infrastructure for a certain kind of climate, and that is rapidly changing. So Peter and I visited some colleges last weekend on our way back from a camp that he was at the University of Michigan. And several parents on those tours asked, do your dorms have air conditioning? And at the University of Chicago, the answer was, some of them do. You probably don't want to be in Chicago during the summer without air conditioning anymore. Our growing patterns have shifted significantly. So this is just a change in Illinois over a single decade, where the growing zones have shifted north by 50 to 100 miles there in just a decade. So the ways that we both plan crops and for those of us who don't do that, think about seasons has shifted significantly. Maybe more importantly, there are assumptions that we have made about our legal codes, about justice, about the world that maybe don't hold up. For instance, that migration is something that you choose. Well, if your island nation is disappearing, that's not an assumption that we can hold anymore. Most interesting to me, he said our theology needs to shift. He asked, does it remain appropriate to think of creation as singing, as the trees shall clap their hands as we sing periodically? Or do we need to think about creation groaning as it waits for humanity to care for it? At one point in this seminar, one of the persons in the audience asked a question in terms of creation care. You've probably all become familiar with that language. It's a language that allowed people across a spectrum of faith and theology to share, in a sense that, of course, we are to care for creation. Josh paused for a minute, and then he said, I'm not talking about creation care. I'm talking about human survival. Something will survive, the world will survive. Certain creatures will adapt well and flourish. What will our survival or flourishing look like in a changing world? I wonder about the balance between our need to worship and to care for one another, to encourage one another, and our need to prophetically imagine new possibilities for what human flourishing might look like. Prophecy is a fundamentally hopeful kind of speech. In this passage from Isaiah, there is held out the hope that if Israel confesses its sin and turns, that salvation will come. As opposed to apocalyptic writings, which often are written from the stance of a people who have so little hope that all they can do is to cry out to God, to dream, to vision that God might bring about a radically different world. In prophecy, there's still the sense that we have agency, we can turn to God and shift how things work. What is the prophetic imagination that is invited of us today? A couple weeks ago, I spent time with the women from Focolare, this Catholic community whose charism, whose vocation is to work for unity, not simply Christian unity, more broadly than that. Some of them were here at the Anabaptism Sunday that we had back in January, I think it was. But being there and hearing about their life together, their commitment to living in community with a shared purse with one another, felt like a glimpse of a new possibility from the way that we live our lives in this culture. Perhaps an old possibility that we have lost. That gives me hope. When I was in Indiana last weekend, I stayed with good friends. He was my pastoring mentor when I first began. And Dave asked me, "What gives you hope today?" And I said, and he agreed then, that it's hard for me to see how we will kind of plan our way out of the mess that we've gotten into. More and more, I find hope in the possibility that there will be enough small demonstration plots, small examples of different values that allow us to live and flourish differently than many of us do in this culture. The Focolare one was one of those. One of the reasons that I am excited about the GIPL possibility here, the Climate Resilience Hub, is because it feels like another one of those little examples that we can be part of, and that we can be part of in a bigger way than we could on our own. I put in the worship announcements email this week, in piecemeal, Mennonite Church USA was encouraging congregations to think about climate resilience and how they can engage in that. We're a small community. There are so many needs around us, and we'll continue to engage those needs as they touch us and as we are able to. It feels to me like climate resilience is one of those needs that is clear and that we have an opportunity with GIPL to participate in a bigger way. The fact that Cody talks about wanting this to be a demonstration plot, that he can then show other communities this is what's possible to do if you find yourself in a space that you cannot continue to maintain your property, rather than selling to a developer and having a plaque on the wall of the condominium lobby, as David shared with us in a prior conversation. That excites me. That feels like a way of pointing ourselves forward in a direction, recognizing that there is all this other needs, all of this other turbulence around us, but in pointing ourselves in a direction and saying that we trust that the Spirit will hold us up and guide us in that. Of course, that's not the only way. That's not the only need. That's not the only possibility. Larry sent an email this week from a group here in Atlanta that had considered a lawsuit in response to the removal of the protection of vulnerable places from ICE. And that group was suggesting a meeting, and Larry was wondering if we wanted to participate in that. We continue to support the work of Casa Eterna. We have people who work with El Refugio and the Stewart Detention Center. All of this work is incredibly important. And I find myself excited about, here's something that we might be able to do with climate resilience. All of it is intertwined, of course. And in all of it, it's important that how we do it demonstrates the fruits of the Spirit, the kind of people that it looks like to be followers of Jesus. In all of it, we pursue the way of justice and peace in a way that invites people to see us as followers of Jesus. That can't be left out. That is why we need to continue to be church and gather and worship and encourage and sustain one another. And so we have choices before us about how we live into a future that is different from the past, how we live in a present that is different from the past, how we recognize that there is something of this scary but potentially exhilarating journey. And also, how can we remain sufficiently buoyed, grounded, held up by God's love and spirit to engage that work together and within God. So the first question that I will leave you with then is a more lighthearted one, and that is simply, which of these images you want to continue to reflect on as we share this morning?